On this weekly reset of patch 10.2.5 we have one thing to highlight, which is of course that this week in Mythic Plus we have Tyrannical, Storming and Raging. Why is this relevant? Well, it is relevant because it is the easiest week of the season. When it comes to Tyrannical, this combination of affixes is by far the easiest one. Even in the ones that show their easiest affix week being fortified, if we had to look at the Tyrannical one, then it's Storming and Raging for Galakrond's Fall, and also Storming and Raging for Atal'Dazar. Even if you look at the average difficulty and the success rate of the keys, right now it's very high. It's almost all of them at 90%. If we had to go to one of the previous fortified weeks, the averages were as low down as 60%, whereas for this Tyrannical week it is much higher. So the suggestion for everyone who still had some low level Tyrannical keys on their scores and they wanted to bump up their rating, this one is quite literally the best week when it comes to Tyrannical. Now, going dungeon by dungeon, starting with Atal'Dazar. Atal'Dazar is quite simple and quite straightforward nowadays. You go straight to Muruzond with Bloodlust, so you can have it back by the time you reach Alonza. You don't need it for your track all the way back to Volcal, because you then want to save it for Yasma. As I said, quite straightforward dungeon, however, it also has the annoyance that the absolute hardest part of the dungeon is at the very end. You know, it's not one of those nice dungeons where you have to survive the first mega pull and either it goes well and you continue or it fucks up horribly and you disband and leave. On this one, everything is quite smooth until you are 30 minutes in and trying to do the last boss. That's still gonna be the hardest part of the dungeon. Unfortunately, this week, what makes it even harder actually is Storming, because while the other bosses are not that big of a deal having to interact with Storming, for Yasma it can become an issue, as you have to often move around in small tight spaces because you are trying to dodge the spiders. You might be, technically speaking, cucked by some swirlies on the ground, blocking your path. So we just said this one is the easiest week of Tyrannical, but when it comes to specifically this boss on this dungeon, Storming actually does make it harder. The dungeon itself as a whole, though, remains one of the easier and more approachable ones when it comes to Tyrannical. Rook is actually quite similar. It is also one of the easier dungeons, and similar to Atal'Dazar, you still bloodlust first pull. Even if it's a bunch of trash, you want to bloodlust it, especially since the first boss is basically just a meme. You also want to bloodlust because, generally speaking, Rook is a 31, 32, 33 minute long dungeon, which means if you bloodlust on minute 0, if you bloodlust on pull, then you can bloodlust at 10, at 20 and 30. So you have 3 more bloodlusts to use throughout the dungeon, where, of course, the most important one will be at the very end, for the last boss of the dungeon, which is similar to Atal'Dazar, the hardest part of this Tyrannical week. You do have the big question about whether or not you want to bloodlust on phase 1 to get away from the very dangerous Shadow Bolt spam, or if you want to bloodlust on phase 2 to get away from the heavier overall party damage and the swarm crowd control of P2. It is in general still recommended for you to go and bloodlust the demon part of the encounter. Talking about annoyances with the weekly affixes, Storming is actually also quite annoying on this dungeon because of the very narrow hallways throughout the dungeon, which can become quite frustrating on Storming. This one specifically, with the Raven's dives that you have to dodge quickly, you might and will get one shot because you face stamp yourself on a swirly and cannot move and get hit by one of these. And I'm pretty sure we will also see some deaths from players during the dodge and run phase, not being able to dodge a swirly and getting hit by the laser beam. That's also a classic on this encounter. We move away, though, from easy and smooth runs where the only concern is the last boss, like Atal'Dazar and Rook, for Darkheart Thicket. Because in Darkheart Thicket, yes, the last boss is actually still a concern, but what is also a concern is the boss before him, and even the boss before him. In fact, only the first boss, only the Archdruid, is the easy one. The boss is far too far away for you to be holding Bloodlust, which means you Bloodlust on pull, and then you get Bloodlust back for the second boss, and then you have Bloodlust back for the last boss. But this means you won't be able to have Bloodlust for Atal'Dazar, which is also quite the nasty, quite the tricky boss to deal with on high Tyrannical keys. Sometimes, even if it's Tyrannical, you won't even have Bloodlust for both of them. Sometimes you are too fast, you will have to Bloodlust even earlier than this boss. You'll have to Bloodlust around here, meaning you will get to skip both of these bosses without Bloodlust. For once, we can say, sure, for once, storming is not too big of a deal in terms of moving around on these bosses, and even raging. There are not that many mobs, even considering you're not on fortified, where raging can become super nasty. It can sometimes, some of the leaps of the Nightclaws, if they hit raging and they're not de-enraged by your party, it can hurt a lot. The poison explosion, if you don't have poison dispel, if it's enraged, can hurt quite a bit. The infamous fortified pull of the dwellers without being de-enraged, without being dispelled, can also hurt quite a lot. But besides that, the real danger is going to be the last trio of bosses on Tyrannical. As a tip and as a reminder, on Atal'Dazar you always want to get closest to the center of the boss when he starts pushing you back, because you will not get pushed back nearly as far if you start from the middle. And also for the even higher key levels, the play would be to constantly be opening up eggs to spawn whelplings to give you higher single target DPS through funnel damage if you have specs that do good funnel single target DPS, but also to allow your healer to just position himself against the wall so he doesn't have to worry about being knocked back and can just stand still and heal you. This is particularly worthwhile if you're playing, for example, with a priest. A disciplined priest in particular is quite a good strat to play around this side of the boss and always clear up the whelplings and let your healer stay against the wall. We then move on to a different flavor of a dungeon, Galakrond's Fall. The flavor that many players will see about this dungeon is essentially going to stop here. That is likely the experience of 70% of the players who go into this dungeon. They get up to this boss and then their run ends. That's kind of how it goes, right? You get the first pull, either this mega first pull with Bloodlust or invisibility skip, mega first pull with the boss and Bloodlust. Then you get your Bloodlust back as you deal with all of the trash around the second boss, and then you die. This has been quite the annoying boss. It still has quite the bugged interactions whenever you have to dispel his debuff mechanic. Especially the tip is to stay away from the guy with the debuff on him. That's because to this day, if you get dispelled and a player is next to you, that player is very likely going to get double hit by the ring of damage going outwards. It will be dispelled next to him and he will take the first tick of damage, and then it will go past him and take the second tick of damage almost instantly, which usually means an instant kill in high enough key levels of Tyrannical. Besides that, the strategy is still the same. Stay on the slow part of the room, on the slow triangle. Once you have 5 seconds left to the debuffs, be in the slow, because 5 seconds later you will have transitioned into the fast. The debuff will drop and you will be able to be instantly dispelled by your healer. What keeps this dungeon quite hard, of course, is the fact that after you go through this boss, you have to still go through quite the nasty one, which is the Blight of Galakrond, and the debuff swapping mechanic you have to go around, which quite often players don't really get. They don't understand the timings of swapping around this debuff. You can swap it to the tank immediately during the paddle phase, the first phase. You can swap it to the tank about 3 to 4 seconds later after getting it, once he is in his second phase. And then the last phase you have to swap it multiple times before you get to have the breath that clears the debuff. This is going to be most of the time what gets players to die on this encounter, the mismanagement of the juggling of the debuff. One of the first dungeons where saving the Bloodlust for the last boss is not even a thing you do very often. You will be able to get your Bloodlust back generally, because this is a 30+ minute dungeon, so if you Bloodlust on first pull at minute 0, you will have minute 10, 20 and 30+ to use your Bloodlust, so generally you will get your Bloodlust back on this boss, but it's not even a necessary thing. There are worse bosses where you want to bloodlust on than Iridicron. If you thought Galakrond's Fall was quite the hard dungeon, well, its sister dungeon is even worse, because Muruzond's Rise has been the entire season the hardest dungeon in general. The first boss is even more annoying, to the point where you want to save your bloodlust for the boss, unlike the previous most other dungeons where you're fine doing a mega pool of trash with bloodlust, even on Tyrannical. In this one, you don't even want to do that, because this boss gets to become quite the slog in high Mythic plus key levels. Because of the absorb shields it has and the multiple intermission phases, you're gonna have to have almost your entire room filled with shit spawned by tier. That's also where you will learn that positioning actually matters on this boss. You won't care about this in a 17 or a 19 or a 22, because the boss will be dead by one transition, but in high enough keys you have to start playing at the edges of the room, because you want to bait the frontals at the edges of the room, so you have more room to play around in, and it gets to be quite the slog, slow and annoying type of boss in this dungeon. Things don't get too much better, because after that boss you want to almost always at this point nowadays go left. After you clear the plaza in the middle, you want to go left, because if you have to choose between using Bloodlust on Chromie or on the Time Lost Battlefield, then the answer will always be this boss, since this one is definitely the more dangerous one of the two. The usual tip for this boss is similar to Tyr. You want to stay at the edge of the room, because you want to bait the frontal, the shockwave, towards the outside of the room. That's because mobs, the NPCs fighting in the middle, whenever they die, killed by the boss, give the boss AoE splash damage on his auto attacks. So if you stay in the middle of the room and then he targets you for shockwave, he gets to kill dozens of those little guys in the middle, which will then translate into the boss doing consistent AoE damage on your group. So you want to bait his AoE on the outside and also bait his Bladestorm chase around the outside of the room to kill as few of the NPCs in the middle of the room as possible. Same goes for the other more dangerous part, being the adds that you want to group together and crowd control to prevent some of the more dangerous parts of the fight, like the bleeds and the mortal strike debuffs going on the healer or on the DPS players. That can become also very deadly. After her you have Chromie. This is, funnily enough, a pretty simple boss that gets messed around by players way too often. Whenever it comes to baiting the clones in the sand puddles, players saying we will just crowd control the clones, and then after the first 20 seconds of the crowd control it will start breaking and players will start panicking and it will turn into a clusterfuck. This is really just about a test of coordination for your group to survive. The last boss is where you will get your Bloodlust back and deal with him without having too many issues, since we haven't mentioned it with Storming. This is not a particularly Storming annoying boss on Tyrannical. Talking about annoying and talking about Storming, there isn't really much of anything too dangerous with Storming when it comes to these bosses in the Everbloom. You do have a few more dangers actually with Raging on this dungeon. Whenever it comes to the Berserkers jumping around, or the Abominations doing their AoE, that's where it can become more deadly if you let them alive with Raging. The more dangerous part of this dungeon is that we are back bloodlusting first pull, because the first boss is too far away to save your Bloodlust on, and also in this case the first boss is too much of a joke to save your Bloodlust for. The annoying part is that the three hardest bosses are all very, very close to each other, which means you cannot save your Bloodlust for each and every one of them. So the one who gets the shaft is the one in the middle, Archmage Soul. You will have Bloodlust here, you will have Bloodlust here, but you won't have it for the middle, which can also be arguably the hardest one of the three. That's where the real challenge for this dungeon will be, surviving this trio of bosses almost back to back. Talking about surviving, Throne of the Tides will also be a challenge. The Bloodlust timings are pretty simple. Bloodlust on first pull, Bloodlust on the second boss, and then Bloodlust on Ozumat. What this creates, however, is you not having Bloodlust for the first boss, which can become quite nasty in high enough keys whenever it comes to having to deal with multiple rounds of Chain Lightning and multiple random deaths in intermission because non-tank players get dogged down by the adds, as well as the even more dangerous no Bloodlust during the Stone Speaker boss, where you have to deal with Flame Shock, on your squishy DPS and healer, as well as Wind Fury melting your tank. This is quite the other challenge when it comes to this dungeon, especially when you have to go through it without Bloodlust. The last of the dungeons is going to be Waycrest Manor. Going back to talking about annoying dungeons for storming, well, this is another one, together with Black Rook whenever it comes to small, narrow corridors, where this is a picture-perfect one for storming being annoying. Here, more and more groups are skipping the whole do a bunch of trash before the first boss. Instead, they pre-invisibility pot before the start of the key, so they can skip this pull to go up the stairs, go to the side, and then jump down the stairs to instantly pull the sisters with Bloodlust. Then you can do the classic that you might have done multiple times of getting to the second boss with 3, 4, 5 minutes left for your Bloodlust. So instead you clear everything in here to get your Bloodlust back, to go for the Goliath, which is also going to be similar to the manifested time ways in Galakrond's Fall, where many groups might end their run in Waycrest Manor due to the problems caused by the soul cage on this boss. Bloodlust in this will of course leave you with no Bloodlust on Ral. Funnily enough, this is the easiest boss of the dungeon, which also gets quite annoying with storming. You have a narrow room filled with puddles that slow you, while you have to do a dance of running left and right to dodge the cone of the boss, with also now storming swirlies you have to dodge. So it can become quite annoying to deal with this pig. Going down to the cellar and then further down to the Lady and Lord Waycrest. These are also done without a Bloodlust. As a tip on this boss, remember, you should, as a DPS or a healer or a tank with an interrupt, focus the Lady Waycrest when she's not active, because she's still casting and she is still slamming a lot of damage on your random DPS or healer. And since you're not really using interrupt on Lord Waycrest, you might as well keep track of Lady Waycrest to use interrupt on her. By the time you're back on the last boss, on Goraktul, Bloodlust will also be back, so it's time to use it on the last boss of Waycrest Manor. This, however, will be already smooth sailing. Goraktul and the boss before that are usually the two easier one, more comfortable ones compared to the early ones you have to go through, in particular the sisters and the Soulbound Goliath, which is, a good thing, so you know if your run is gonna do well or not by the first 15 minutes of the run, rather than having to discover your run is doomed at the very last boss. So these are the dungeons on this week's Tyrannical, Storming, Raging, which I think was worth highlighting since, as mentioned, this is bound to be, once more, the easier week of the season when it comes to Tyrannical difficulty of dungeons. Hoping that some of you are already well busy with trying to push some keys on this easy week of Tyrannical. We are now leaving each other on this Thursday. Yeah, on this Thursday. We are, as usual, starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution, but also the help to the growth of the channel, which can, don't forget, be given still for free. You can like and comment down below, for example, or you can subscribe to the channel itself. Or both, actually. Yeah, that's also a good idea. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, oh my fucking holy shit, this nose has been itching for the past 15 minutes. What is going on?